So what if Astra Militarum but a bit more Xenos possessed? Let's talk about one different way to play the forces of the Hammer of the Emperor under the thrall of a Xenos cult. Let's talk about some Brood Brothers and what they can do in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Guard and Genestealer cults, and with the new Astra Militarum book out and about, and tournament legal points going live this week, let's talk about one of the most unusual ways to play the army. The new Guard book brought a whole bunch of different ways that you can play the faction, 5 different detachments in the Codex, plus the Bridgehead Strike for Grotmus, but for this one let's focus on the 7th way that you can take a good contingent of Guard along to a fight, bringing as allies alongside the Genestealer cult in the Brood Brothers detachment. I feel like it's certainly one way in which you can expand a Guard army if you really want to. I certainly had a bit of fun with that myself, converting up a whole bunch of Guardsmen to work for Acolytes with a whole bunch of Genestealer bits, and running the regular Guardsmen as neophytes, and over quite a few other Genestealer cult units along the way over the years as well. I must admit though, the new post-Codex way of doing things has certainly been a bit less motivational to field a mixed list compared with before. Prior to the Codex, you could just take up to a quarter of your datasheets as Astra Militarum within a select range, and that meant that you could just throw in a few cheap units to help with whatever strategy that you otherwise had, whereas now you only have to field them in the Brood Brother Auxilia detachment. You do actually need to focus as the Guard and Genestealer cult both being part of the same strategy. Plus you do lose really quite a lot on just about every Guard datasheet on taking them in the Genestealer cult allies section as opposed to in the Codex itself. Genestealer cult have generally been doing pretty well, but the Brood Brother Auxilia has been a bit of an exception to that rule. People seem to have been doing at least okay with literally every other detachment besides that one. Still though, I thought it could be fun to take a second look at it now we've got a Guard Codex with a bunch of new rules. So for this one, let's talk through the detachment and what units that you can field side by side, and there might just be a special guest appearance from a well-known Genestealer cult faction expert later in the video. Keep your eyes peeled for infiltrators there. Jumping into the detachment though, let's talk Brood Brothers Auxilia, and alongside the Genestealer cult units you can basically take half of your army as Astra Militarum, though they are limited from a set list. You can't have any epic heroes, no commissars, scions, ogrins or rattlings, no tech priests, engine seers, preachers or aircraft. I feel like some of those units are perhaps bigger losses than others. Maybe ogrins wouldn't have been terrible just given they've got a lot of datasheet power and are nice and cheap, plus don't really usually have too many synergies anyway, and I feel like Militarum Tempestus could at least have been fairly interesting, even if there might be a bit of overlap rule between all the deep striking stuff that Genestealer cults can do anyway. There are some big drawbacks to taking Guard outside of their Codex though. They don't get orders and voice of command, which is really quite a big deal for literally any of the damage dealers really. Big scary things like Rogal Dawns would usually be hitting on a 3+, typically getting an order from somewhere, though here they'll be hitting on a 4. And they wouldn't have any of the further buffs from the detachments that are actually tailor-made for the Guard, so a few more synergy options there, so they wouldn't get Born Soldiers from Combined Regiment for example, or the swathe of tank support stratagems that you could get from Hammer of the Emperor, so some quite big trade-offs there as well. For the orders thing, bear in mind that Kazakin can still use their inbuilt self-order apparently though. I believe that was in an FAQ, and for the lack of orders, artillery in particular would also hate this quite a bit at the moment, given that they don't have the heavy keyword anymore, so usually only hit on a 5+ indirect now, which maybe is a shame as that could be another area that the Genestealer cult could really benefit from. Going with one of these big allied detachments though does mean that you have an unusually big unit pool to draw from though. The datasheets themselves might not necessarily get the best support in the world from this one, but there is a bit of strength to being able to pick the exact right units for the battlefield roles from the choice of 2 factions, and also there's a fair bit of fun factor playing mix and match as well. I feel like with Genestealer cults and Brood Brothers, Games Workshop does have a bit of a habit of changing how allies work just about every edition or two though. I feel like since their inception with Genestealer cults being able to ally to Astra Militarum, things have changed massively over and over again as to exactly which units that you can field and how much it makes sense to field a mix. Getting into the detachment itself though, and the core rule for the army is integrated tactics, and this one's basically a Guard buff for the Genestealer cult shooting units. The idea is that you have a Guard unit that shoots solely at one enemy within 18 inches, so you can't divide fire or anything if it would make sense to, and then Genestealer cult units after that will all get +1 to hit the target that effectively got marked by that Guard unit, which can be quite a big deal for certain Genestealer cult units, maybe the biggest deal for things like neophytes with their seismic cannons and mining lasers, which feel like they're in the best place to really like that +1 to hit, or I guess maybe things like demo charges jumping out of a Goliath truck or something. It does require a bit of positioning and having certain units though, and you might require the Guard units to shoot suboptimally to be able to set it up, so it does have its downsides, and maybe incentivizes having a bunch of small Guard units that you can trigger the buff without feeling too bad about it. Maybe things like transports or scout sentinels might not be the worst idea in the world. For the stratagems, first up for one command point we've got In the Shadow of Iron. That one allows you to redeploy a cult ambush marker somewhere within 6 inches of a guard vehicle unit. I feel like that was actually genuinely quite a big one before, but now they've changed cult ambush, so the cult ambush tokens aren't make or break for the units to come back, they're just not really quite as required. Though I guess in theory you could set up some sort of rapid ingress style shenanigan with them. Still feels a bit borderline gain for a whole command point though. For 1 CP, there's Regimental Reinforcements. I feel like this one's quite a fun one. One Astra Militarum infantry unit that isn't a character or artillery squad gets to be put in cult ambush on a 3+ when they're destroyed, and you deploy a new token on the board. I feel like this one's probably one of the better uses of the command points here, and even if it's not guaranteed, a 3+ chance to say put 20 infantry back into strategic reserve or 10 Kazakin or something like that could be a really big deal. Even if on a 3+ it's not super reliable, that's still on average say 60 points worth of Kazakin that you're getting back or so, that could then be off the board and self-order when they're in cold ambush and then turn up to the fight. I'm a little bit uncertain as to whether or not you can use this more than once per game anymore though. The balance data slate says that you can only use stratagems that add a new unit into your army once per game, and this one sort of does, but indirectly. It doesn't actually use the word new unit anywhere on this stratagem, but Cult Ambush does function by creating new units. I'm genuinely a little bit unsure as to whether or not it means that it's once per game only for this one. If not though, then it looks like it's certainly one that you could justify using every turn that you can. Otherwise, for 2 CP, there's acceptable losses. One Astra Militarum unit in your army can shoot an engaged unit that's in close combat with a Genestealer Cult unit, but at the price of your Genestealer Cult units taking D3+1 mortal wounds on a 5+. I feel like that one's just a bit niche really. 2 command points is a lot. It comes with a bit of risk of self-damage, and a lot of the time you might just be able to fall back with a Genestealer Cult unit if you desperately need to shoot the thing that they were in close combat with. Perhaps the biggest advantage of it could be if there's a model tagging a Genestealer Cult unit, and then you shoot it down, and then that Genestealer Cult unit could shoot and charge freely after that perhaps. You would need to use it on a guard unit that's big and scary enough to actually matter though. Only one guard unit being able to do that for a big 2 command points is a pretty huge investment. For 1 command point, there's Suppress and Overwhelm. Shoot something with an Astra Militarum unit to use this one, and then the unit that got shot can't fire Overwatch, and you get to reroll charges against it with your Genestealer Cults. I feel like this one maybe sounds better than it is really. Denying Overwatch is great, but most of the time there's no real reason that your opponent would really have to wait until the charge phase to trigger it. Most of the time they'd have the opportunity to do it in the movement phase, so denying the Overwatch with a thing that you can only trigger in your own shooting just isn't really that reliable. For charges as well, you could just charge with a Genestealer Cult unit and then command point reroll it if they fail, and that way for the same command point spend you could still have the reroll, and you don't even necessarily need to spend it if you pass it already. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Symbiotic Destruction. This one gives both your guard units and a Genestealer Cult unit reroll wound rolls of 1 against 1 target, but they also can't shoot anything else. This one does have some reliable damage buffs, and it's not nothing, but it only amounts to a plus 17% damage boost for 2 units, and that would come at the price of splitting fire with any weapons that might have made sense to, and for the damage increase that it gives you, it's not crazy really. I guess in theory you could have a really big guard unit, like a Rogue or Dawn tank, or even a Baneblade or something. That could just fire all of its guns into 1 target and get the damage buff, and then that could trigger the +1 to hit, and also give you reroll wound rolls of 1 for a Genestealer Cult unit. Again, could be alright, or maybe something like a trio of Ridge Runners, or perhaps a Neophyte block. Finally, for 1 command point, there's a Dark Network. And this one's an interesting reactive move to enemies setting up from reinforcements. You get to move 6 inches for a guard or Genestealer Cult non-vehicle unit after an enemy unit sets up from reserve within 12 inches of them. This does make you screeny infantry for deep strikes really quite powerful really. It means that you could have them backpedal, so you absolutely guarantees know that you're not getting charged out of deep strike by any one unit that you don't want to. And depending on the location might even allow them to hide behind terrain or move more bodies onto an objective or something. I feel like this one's maybe a bit opponent dependent, but in the right situation that could be the difference between one of your units on the front lines just living or dying. Finally we get to the enhancement, and there's at least a few interesting ones here. There's one called Martial Espionage, which is 25 points, and you give this to a Genestealer Cult infantry model, and they can buff a friendly Astra Militarum infantry or mounted unit once per turn within 9 inches, and when that unit's selected to shoot you gain an extra AP1. It's basically a sort of not quite orders for Genestealer Cult buffing guard. And that could be alright on a big 20-man squad or some Kazakin perhaps. You could use that on the artillery too, so it'd work on the field ordnance or the artillery team if you wanted a bit more AP on them. For 15 points there's Adaptive Reprisal, and again is for a Genestealer Cult infantry character. One Genestealer unit within 9 inches can use free heroic intervention. I guess not awful, it feels a little bit out of place with the rest of the detachments. Perhaps not too bad as a points filler, as it can just come up opportunistically, but then it's often worth the command point if it does anyway. The hero returned is 20 points. That one gives you +1 OC and +1 leadership for a Genestealer Cult unit. I guess it does shore them up on objectives, perhaps could be handy on aberrants, which are going to be tough enough to tank some fire. It does feel a touch weirdly pricey for 20 points though. And finally, there's a nice cheap one called Fire Point Commander. This one's 10 points for a Genestealer Cult infantry model to Overwatch on a 5+. I think given the fact that it's so cheap, it feels like perhaps the best value one out of these. It just works really quite well with the primers who can reroll all their hit rolls anyway, so it means that their neophyte block will be hitting with 5 out of 9 of their shots. Really not too bad on Overwatch at all, when you could take another chunk out of an enemy unit advancing on their position. Overall, between all that, there is some good stuff here. The core rule could help some neophyte damage blocks. +1 to hit is rather nice, even if it takes a bit of setup. The unit access is good. Genestealer Cults can get access to big scary tanks, indirect fire, and some chaff units. And on the flip side, Guard don't have access to quite so many melee things. Rough Riders could still be fine here though. The Genestealer Cults still get all their resurgence points as well, so while their chunk of the army might still only be half the army or so, quite a lot of that chunk could respawn, and between that and the regenerating guardsmen, you could put quite a few more models back on the table. And for the supporting rules and stratagems, I feel like it's maybe a bit hit and miss. These 3 stratagems and the Overwatch 5+ do seem a bit more standout than some maybe. The question is just whether or not it's worth the orders and guard detachment benefits that you're passing up, plus a chunk of their datasheets, plus the Genestealer Cult detachments that can support their own units better. Let's talk through a few options for units though, and with that in mind I think I can just about hear something coming across the airwaves.
I did it, Igor. I hacked the Imperial channel. See? We don't need a Clamorverse. With all this talk of 5 or 6 Astra Militarum detachments, you should know that there is another detachment that the Inquisition doesn't want you to know about. The Brood Brother Auxilia. It is a great detachment, thematically. You get all of the, well, most of the important Imperial Guard units and some awesome new friends with big hammers. More arms to hug you and bike recon if your planet doesn't use cavalry. You don't need to be part of the Bladed Cog to know that the planet Attila is in dire need of industrialization. So join the Brood Brothers, but not all of you. There are some recruits we prefer over others and a few restrictions. There is a minimum IQ requirement, so no Ogrons. And we don't wish to stereotype, but no criminal ratlings, or for that matter enforcers who went to posh school like Commissars or Tempestus Scions. And we have our own way of worshipping the Emperor in his glorious four-armed way, so no priests or tech priests. If you can fly, we would like you to transport some important cargo off-world, but you won't be needed on the battlefield. If you already have a title and belong to a regiment like Ursula Creed, we cannot transfer you. We do not have the paperwork. So this will be a real quick mini tier list. There are some units that we don't want so much. Leaders especially. We have a great and frankly too big selection of leaders in the Genestealer cult. Any officers that join lose the voice of commandability, which is usually the main reason to take them. Even though tank commanders come with a big tank, their non-commissioned versions are cheaper and work better for our purposes. Cadians are not required. We have neophytes with more weapons and sticky objectives. Most of the units that Mr. Tactics has put low on his own tier list are also not going to be great for the Genestealer cult Brood Brothers. I trust him as an Imperial Guard player to know what he's talking about. Although the Genestealer cult has a lot of infantry, there are more infantry units that we would like from the Imperial Guard. A big unit of the Death Corps of Krieg, they shoot better after taking casualties, and with a supporting character like a Sanctus with the Martial Espionage enhancement, that will improve their gun AP by 1. That can be a horrifying damage dealer at medium to short range. We previously used Catachans to scout to objectives, but we have a new favourite, the Combat Engineers. They are so cheap, but we know that's getting patched. I am happy to take them at 70 points. They can scout up. When the oppressors come close, free grenades from one of the units and let those mines loose. The Genestealer cult already have a lot of bombs and demolitions, mainly from the Reductus Saboteur. Engineers still make the cut. If they shoot the enemy, Genestealer cult units get +1 to hit against that same enemy unit. Small units are perfect for conveying that detachment special rule. And we are not without orders of our own. As per the Genestealer Cult FAQ, Kazakin Warrior Elite can order themselves in this detachment. Kazakin come with a lot of fancy guns, hitting on a 3+, and are probably one of the best infantry units you can take, especially when they can return with the reinforcement stratagem on a 3+, once per game. So who should join up? Do you have a big gun? If alien monsters were to arrive and try and eat us, like, the only possible thing is some orc squig type monster. We need anti-monster attacks. Katachan heavy weapon squads are the favourite. Krieg teams are also good, if only for that 48-inch range las pistol. Armoured sentinels with a las cannon or autocannon, plasma cannon, some sort of cannon, and a hunter-killer missile re-rolling wound rolls against monsters and vehicles is very welcome. The new artillery team. They have a great defensive profile to survive counter-battery fire, and they have a big cannon with strength 12 and damage 3. Oh yes. The Basilisk is okay for slowing down the enemy and stopping Space Marines, but it looks less attractive. I mean for army lists. No one would doubt that the length of its barrel was attractive, but the artillery team siege cannon also has a long barrel with a bigger punch and the heavy keyword to more likely hit. The Krieg heavy weapons teams with big flamers make the perfect outflanking unit, and the Genestealer Cult love reserves. You arrive and burn the enemy, maybe a cheeky overwatch in the enemy's coming turn, because you won't be spending your command points on many of the detachment stratagems, that's for sure. And then they fire on death on a 3+. That is a lot of burning in one battle round. Do you like being alone? I mean operating independently without needing orders. A Lehman Russ battle tank can do so. They reroll hit rolls without any support being required, and you get multi-melters or plasma cannons and a las cannon. If you have a bigger tank available to support us, that is appreciated, or bigger still, and have a super heavy. I am partial to the Shadow Sword. No squadron keyword? No problem. We don't have orders to issue anyway. Those are the direct damage weapons, or you can support your friendly local cult. The Hellhound removes cover against the enemy, which works for Imperial Guard shooting and cultist unit shooting. And because of the detachment rule, those cultists get an extra bonus +1 to hit. So where can you find out more? You may want to look into this Christian von Carmian fellow. He has a YouTube channel with a lot of valuable videos. He has a Discord server with helpful people who will assist you with army lists and enjoy looking at your models. You can talk to Christian von Carmian. That is one of the von Carmian VTuber Ko-fi tiers. A Brood Brothers tactics and tier list videos planned for February, whenever he can get the Guard Codex, have some updated points, and play enough games with the new units to know what he's talking about and offer some surprising tactical insight. Genestealer Cult information without the vampire VTuber Christian von Carmian is also available elsewhere. And non-Genestealer Cult information is also available from Christian von Carmian, especially if you are a lover of the Adeptus Sororitas and the Death Watch. Whichever way round you view it, you need to know your enemy. Have a great day of 40k.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Von Carmian. Certainly appreciate the insights on the picks of the guard for the Brood Brothers. I feel like for the Genestealer Cult side of things, the detachment's main draw is generally towards the range things, given that they work with the core buff. Plus, I guess they can also make use of the Overwatch enhancements and the symbiotic destruction stratagem. It's not like the Genestealer Cults have tons of ranged units, so it's probably mainly Primus and Neophytes for reroll all your hits, and one of those with the Overwatch enhancement seems like a pretty good choice, and then hopefully have a guard unit to mark with them for the core rule. Achilles Ridge Runners are pretty nice as well. You could have them hitting on a 2+ with mining lasers if you wanted to, though admittedly in a list where you've got half your units being other things that aren't Genestealer Cults, their buffing rules might not be quite as critical. That's not to say that all the other units aren't good in their own right, but I feel like there's not quite so much that's just stand out above and beyond what they do normally, at least for this detachment. In any case, here's just one idea for an army list, putting a few of the more obvious things on the table to deal some damage. Here I've gone all in on Primuses with Neophytes, 3 Primuses and 1 with the Overwatch 5+ enhancement, each leading a block of Neophytes with Weber's grenade launchers, mining lasers and seismic cannons. Beyond that there's a couple of Ridge Runners with mining lasers and 1 with a mortar and survey auger, and that one can hand out some ignores cover and AP -1 to hopefully make those neophytes shoot extra nasty with a +1 to hit, reroll all hits, ignores cover and extra AP against their targets. Otherwise there's 2 different squads of acolytes and a unit of pure strains to infiltrate for the mid-board. For the guard contingent, there's 3 scout sentinels with las cannons. They're at least fairly chunky and annoying to deal with their fairly good toughness for the cost. They can contribute a tiny bit of firepower, but can both spot targets for the guard with reroll ones to hit, and they could also be quite a good unit to shoot at one of the targets to hand out the detachment buff to those neophytes. It looks like you don't have to hit them for the detachment rule as well, so they could trigger that even if the las cannon misses. Otherwise, there's 2 big Rogel Dawn battle tanks, which should be a whole stack of stats that the opponent might struggle to deal with, even if they're not going to be hitting quite as hard without orders. They've got oppressor cannons, pulverizer cannons, multi-melters and melter guns, so hopefully should have a good amount of damage to deal with some tougher stuff in the enemy army. And between that pair and the neophyte blocks deep striking in, there should be a fair bit of damage output from the list. You could maybe even use that reroll ones to wound stratagem if desired. Finally, there's a unit of 10 Kazakin in a Taurox. They'll be able to zoom up the board nice and quickly, hit some enemies with the special weapons up close and personal, and then could be a good target for that 3+ chance to cold ambush later on. Probably not exactly optimal or anything, though I don't think there's any enormous consensus as to how these get run in competitive. In general, Genestealer Cult players do tend to favour the other more general purpose detachments that focus on their own units. In any case though, let me know your thoughts as to the Xenos Cult Imperial Guard. Have you tried out the detachments at all since the Guard Codex rules have been out? I look forward to hearing your takes if so. And how would you be tempted to get the most out of the detachment? A massive thank you to Christian von Carmian for taking the time to appear in the video as well. Be sure to check him out on his channel, which I'll link down in the video description below. In any case, I'll leave that one there though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this, and check out the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support down in the video description below. There's also the affiliate discount links if you happen to be picking up any Warhammer 40K things in the near future. They help to support the channel and save a bit versus Games Workshop, also linked down in the description. A massive thank you for listening to all of you out there, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.